which makes it even more irritating, because just when you think you might have something that would challenge, he challenges it himself, and then said, no, don't believe me on that. What I wrote there was rubbish, and here's a new version. So, but generally that's a good way to go in science. You should keep updating. Not unlike this guy. Came back and said, yeah, I thought I'd said everything I had to say. No, I don't. I've got some more. And if you listen to me, you might like what I say. So, to build a little on that, and we'll get to Murray in a minute, Skinner wrote this book in 1957. 2 years later, as everyone knows in psychology, it was roundly criticised by Noam Chomsky. Now, Chomsky, in many respects, I think, got a lot wrong in his review, but I think he was fundamentally right about one thing. And he admits now, to this day, that his early linguistics or psycholinguistics work was off base, and he's corrected an awful lot of it, and has recognised that you need to move on as well, even if you know Chomsky. But what the core criticism, I think, that Chomsky levelled at the Skinner's verbal behaviour was, in one sense, I think, correct. He didn't emphasise novelty, emergence, and derivation enough. It is in the book. To Skinner's credit, he was sensitive to these things. And he himself actually coined the phrase frame when he talked about autoclitic frames. And he actually gives some examples of things of actual relational frames in the book. But they occur very late. They're not central to the account. And in one sense it made sense at the time, because Skinner was writing the book when even the concept of a conditional discrimination was not something that was widely understood. That only emerged later, in the 60s. So he was writing the book at a time when the information that he needed maybe to have adjusted, or to have written a book that was closer maybe to, or more sensitive to emergence, to novelty, to the richness and complexity of language, that would emerge later on. So in one sense verbal behaviour was premature, but in another sense it was important, it was key, because it was the first serious attempt by a radical behaviourist to write a text that attempted to explain the complexity of human language by appealing only to selection by consequences. Because what Skinner wrote in there, he proposed a series of verbal operants, or what he called verbal operants. So things like tax and mans, intraverbals and so on, were cast as operants, as actions, verbal actions that occurred and then were strengthened or weakened by the consequences that followed. So the ability to name something such as this was treated as an act in which, if I omit the word table or desk, then I will receive social reinforcement for doing so, or at least I won't be punished. If I say, please sit at the snake, or please sit at the aardvark, someone say, what are you talking about? That's a desk, it's a table, I will be corrected. And if I refuse to use language in the way that everyone else is using it, eventually I will probably be deemed not fit to interact in the wider community, and will even be maybe diagnosed as having some brain disorder or some psychological problem, because I am not behaving in a way that concords with the wider community that allows me to gain the social reinforcers that I need for sharing your language. Hence Wittgenstein's idea, there's no such thing as a private language. It will be useless to you. Because what is language for? It's for communicating. It's for influencing the behaviour of others and allowing others to influence us. And that's key. There's no appeal to representations or cognitive representations, only to the functions that language has, the outcomes that it has as we use it in a day-to-day bit. And that's how it evolves in the first place. Anyway, language would not evolve. It didn't evolve so we would have art and literature and so on. They're byproducts of something far more mundane, the ability to communicate more effectively with each other so that we as groups and individuals would survive. Now, 1957, Skinner publishes the book. 2 years later it's roundly condemned, and the apocryphal story, if you like, for psychology is that ushered in the cognitive revolution, and as a result psychology was changed forevermore. Behaviorism got shuffled off centre stage, as indeed it did, but radical behaviorism in one sense was left untouched by this. It carried on. Organisations were founded, journals were founded, the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behaviour, the Journal of Applied Behaviour Analysis, the Association for Behaviour Analysis, later ABAI, and then spin out organisations such as the Association for Contextual Behavioural Science. So, and it's now rising again in many ways in psychology. There's a recognition in cognitive psychology that the functional approach to psychology has something to offer. And one of the reasons that we are in Ghent is because that recognition is beginning to spread within the community, that we need to take this area more seriously again. And you're starting to see articles appear in mainstream cognitive journals about relational frame theory and behavioural psychology generally. Now, 9 years later, in 1966, Skinner writes a paper that is fundamental to the development of relational frame theory, and it's the one which he did about instructional control and problem solving. It attracts virtually no attention outside of behaviour analysis. That ship has sailed. Cognitive psychology is now the dominant force, and what Skinner says at this point, outside of the social commentary text that he wrote, like Beyond Freedom and Dignity and so on, would be ignored. But he writes this article in which he says that the way in which humans solve problems, one way in which they solve problems that gives them an advantage is through the ability to use rules to affect the behaviour of others and to listen to rules and be affected by them. He largely focuses on the behaviour of the listener in rules. And he says the thing about getting an instruction or a rule is that it allows you to solve a problem without having to contact the contingencies directly. So you can learn to cook some food without having to half poison yourself by eating food that's uncooked. It allows you to pass on important information to your children and say, you can eat this berry, the red one, but don't eat the yellow one. The yellow one is poisonous and will make you very ill and might even kill you. This one is safe, you can eat this. You can only eat this one if you cook it or boil it. It's best to, cook meat, and if it smells, don't eat it, and so on and so forth. So you can pass on lots and lots of information with rules, so you don't have to learn through trial and error. This is a tremendous advance forward for the human species. And it is perhaps the reason why we have come to dominate the planet in the way that we have. Whether that's a good or bad thing remains to be seen, but we are a very weak, very slow-moving primate. There's no reason. The only way that we have come to dominate in the way that we have is because we evolved an increasingly complex ability to cooperate with each other through language. And our language became increasingly sophisticated, and then once it got written down, you're really off to the races, because you can write something and it can get passed on to the next generation and the next generation. Long after I'm dead, people can read relational frame theory and say, what was that guy going on about? But your words survive to tell tale. And the religion, the Bible, and so on, holy texts, are a way of writing down ways to live, advice on how to build your culture, to live in, if you like, to live good lives, lives that are safe and protected, and so on. Now, Skinner's work does lead to a lot of experimental work in behaviour analysis, far more than verbal behaviour ever did. But again, outside of behaviour analysis, it doesn't really attract much attention. Although, funnily enough, in cognitive psychology now, mainstream cognitive psychology, even neuroscience, they're starting to pay a great deal more attention to learning through instructions and how learning through instructions might differ from learning through direct experience. And this is a really important area in mainstream psychology. But one thing that Skinner did in that paper is he said that what rules do is they specify contingencies. They specify the behaviours that are involved in getting access to things. So if it says, you know, if the berry is this colour, don't eat it. If it's this colour, you can. It specifies what is safe and what is not safe and what the consequences will be. If I eat the yellow one, I will get sick and not be well. If I eat the red one, I won't be sick and I'll survive and I'll get some food. So specification, how rules specify contingencies remained unexplained. And this is where this man came in, Murray Sidman. And Murray Sidman, in 1971, only 5 years after Skinner had proposed the concept of rule-governed behaviour, discovered, if you like, what came to be known as equivalence relations or equivalence classes. Again, put up your hand if you have heard of equivalence relations or equivalence classes. So, okay. If you don't put up your hand, we're in trouble. Okay. Now, what Murray did, he almost stumbled upon this. He and his research group were studying the ability of how to teach profoundly learning disabled individuals how to read. And during the course of this research, he and his colleagues had spent many months training and teaching someone to point to a picture when they heard the name and to say the name when they heard it said to them. And then spontaneously one day in the lab, when they were testing the individual's ability to read things, the individual in question started to spontaneously show behaviours that they had not predicted. And you can read this account in his book, 1994 book called Equivalence Relations, A Research Story. It's a lovely book, it's wonderful. I recommend it to anyone to get an insight into what it was like to work in Murray's lab at that time. And having stumbled upon it in 1971, he had the ability for this person to show patterns of relating that had not been directly taught was seen as astounding, because you couldn't apparently explain it by looking at what the person had been trained or reinforced or rewarded for doing. So if I put it into classic equivalence speak, if you train somebody to relate A to B as just arbitrary stimuli, pictures and squiggles and sounds, and A to C, then spontaneously that person will reverse those relations. They will relate B to A, and they will relate C to A, they will relate B to C and C to B, without directly teaching them to do so. And they will do that. Any small amount of training will give rise to these behaviours that haven't been reinforced for that individual in the past. And only at this stage did Murray say, you can genuinely read. It's only at this stage that you are showing what we can describe as genuine symbolic behaviour. And Murray then says, it's only when you get that you then can get rules to specify contingencies. In other words, specification, technically in behavioural psychology, means that words and other symbols are in equivalence relations with the things to which they refer. So when I say yellow berry, it's arbitrary sounds. They participate in equivalence relations, as demonstrated by Murray in his lab, with actual yellow berries. You're specifying. And then if I say they will make you sick, then make you sick participates in equivalence relations with feelings of sickness, thoughts of being sick, and so on. And so I can present you with a rule that specifies a contingency which allows you to avoid having to learn things directly. This is a major, major breakthrough. And I don't think in relational frame theory, generally, we've honoured this man enough or sufficiently well. It was in behavioural psychology, and I think psychology generally, a major advance, because for the first time in the history of psychology, in the history of science, we had a technical account of what it means for to symbolise something, to understand something. We had a technical definition of meaning itself, of symbolic meaning that we didn't have previously. And that you don't even have that in mainstream psychology to this day. If you say what is a symbol, or they say it's something that's processed inside the mind, and then there are operations on the symbols and move them around and produce outcomes and so on. But what does it actually point to? It show it to me in the lab, demonstrate it to me in a laboratory in a naturalistic, monistic way. And that's what Murray did. He gave that to us. It was a great gift, incredible insight, and one that should be fully acknowledged. Okay, so I think that's a long time to introduce an RFT. If you just get the general background, you'll understand what's driving it. What comes next in the story? Okay, so we have Darwin, selection by consequences. We have Wittgenstein, language is a game, it's not a representational system. We have Skinner, I need to work out what the games of the language are, experimentally, empirically, and I'm going to do that with the concept of the operant. I'm going to work out how these things evolve in the lifetime of the individual, and I propose verbal behaviour. Not quite right. I propose rule-governed behaviour, instructional control, real move forward, real advance there. Murray comes along and clarifies how rules specify contingencies, and now radical behaviourism, or the behaviourism of Skinner, is underway as an approach to understanding the complexities of human language and cognition in a way that is unique and different from any other approach in psychology, or even science for that matter, in my humble opinion. And by the way, these are all my own views, obviously. So, but I can only give you my view. Okay, just give me a second now. Okay. When Murray suggested the concept of the equivalence relation, it, as I said, was really important for the field. And he suggested that we use the terms symmetry, transitivity, equivalence, and he also used reflexivity at the time. And he focused his work, which was the correct thing to do at that time, on equivalence relations and nothing else. Around the time that Murray had proposed this or first broke in 1971, it took 10 years really for that work to take traction. And it was only in 1982 that he published an article in Jeb, a rather large one, which was found fundamental in changing the way in which we look at equivalence relations. And that was the systematic failure to demonstrate even the simplest equivalence relation, symmetry if you like, in non-humans. It was in baboons and rhesus monkeys were the animals he tended to work with. So it didn't start with relatively stupid animals like pigeons. It started with primates like us. They should be able to do it. And they clearly failed, despite his best efforts and that of his research team, to show symmetry in these higher primates. He worked with 4 or 5-year-old children at a time, and they produced perfect symmetry, no problem. Just train them, they do it. You practically do it in a day, and weeks and months of training with the primates didn't work so well. That's in 1982. 1982, that article was published along with his colleagues. Behavioural folks start to pay attention to this. This is now a really key area because you bumped up against something that not only conceptually looks like it's symbolic, but empirically looks like it's symbolic. It looks like this is something that humans can do that non-humans cannot. And this is troublesome to some extent to radical behavioural people. They're the ones who held on to the continuity assumption. The journals were full of papers on, guess what, non-human learning, the assumption being that non-human learning would inform our understanding of the psychology of humans. And it turns out, that might not apply as forcefully as we thought. And so the challenge was laid down. 20 years later, well, almost 20 years later, 2 researchers in the UK, Neil Dugdale and Fergus Lowe, who passed away not so long ago, published another article. It was the first issue of the Journal of Experimental Behaviour, that again failed to demonstrate, symmetry in chimpanzees that had spent many, many, many years actually being language trained. They came from the famous Savage Rumbaugh laboratory, well known for training language in chimpanzees. And so it looked like what researchers had been doing in attempting to train language in chimpanzees had not allowed them to even generate symmetry in non-humans. And these were perhaps the best candidates on the planet, or at least some of the best candidates, non-human candidates on the planet, who should have been able to do this based on language training. So it looked like what the Savage Ramboughs had been doing had not been language training at all, not in its symbolic form. They were doing very clever things with existing behavioural principles to produce things that looked like language, but wasn't symbolic language as defined by Sidman and his colleagues. And so this now led, from the 80s, and still to this day, there was a special issue of JAB in 2014 that went back and revisited this. I had one of my students had a small article in there on this. Again, it's still a debate. There is still no clear, unequivocal evidence that non-humans can demonstrate even the simplest of abilities. There are some arguments that they show associative symmetry, but they change the very definition of symmetry, and quite rightly call it associative, to, if you like, suggest that there may be some evidence of derived relation responding to non-humans. I'm not averse to that. As a relational frame theorist, there's no need to say that there's absolutely no ability to do it. But at this stage, I think we have to accept that the ability to show even equivalence relations, let alone the complexity that we see in RFT, as I'm going to outline shortly, will ever be something we see in non-humans. Relational framing, or derived relations, as I will explain, is something that looks like it's right at the heart of human language and cognition, in the selectionistic, naturalistic sense of that word. So, what emerges next? As I said, so 1982, there's this famous paper by Murray Sidman, 10 years after he's discovered equivalence relations. In 1982, Steve Hayes, just shortly thereafter, is a clinical psychologist, trained clinical psychologist, clinical researcher, who's struggling with, apparently according to his own account, his own anxiety, his own panic attacks, and also how to develop an account, a behavioural, a more useful behavioural approach to clinical psychology, adult clinical psychology, behavioral analysis was always very good at dealing with learning disabilities, but less successful in the domain of human outpatient clinics and dealing with therapy. And so one of the things Steve was attempting to do was to develop behaviourally informed therapy that was naturalistic and take behavioural principles, and he was bumping up against some of these problems about what is specification, what are rules, and so on, and taking the work of certainly Skinner, taking the work of Sidman, and many of the finest figures in our field at that time, and particularly the work of Sidman. He said, this is it. This is where rules, which he'd seen as fundamentally important for understanding human psychological suffering, and Yvonne will talk more about that this afternoon, he grappled with this idea and did something, again, that I think was a major move forward for the field. He said, let's think of equivalence relations not as something that humans do just spontaneously. And in fact, work has started to emerge that show that very young children couldn't do it either. If they were pre-verbal or severely learning disabled, their ability to show even equivalence relations was compromised. The ability to relate equivalently seemed to correlate with, run in parallel with, develop and get refined as they became more verbally sophisticated. And there were papers around that time by both Steve and even myself that showed that the ability to show equivalence relations correlated with the ability to show equivalence relations correlated with verbal ability. The more verbal you were, the better able you were to derive relations. The work is correlational and so on, but nonetheless it suggested a path. So what Steve then said is that equivalence relations are only one type of verbal operant. There are many of them. And if we take that approach and we think of equivalence relations as something that is learned, it's an operant, then there are many of them. And if we take that view and we build out the complexity, then you can think of putting these operants together in increasingly complex ways. You're now building up what are referred to as relational networks. And now things start to look more like natural language. And the power and complexity of human language starts to emerge in a way that I could never see it reading Skinner. I could just about get some sense of it reading Sidman, but he was locked into equivalence relations and nothing else, and I couldn't quite get it there. The first time I read the first paper on relational frame theory, which was a preprint, I read it on a train. I said, my God, this is it. Steve Hayes has broken human language and cognition. And I was sold 30 years ago. And my career changed from, I went back and annoyed the hell out of my then supervisor and said, I'm not doing the PhD I was doing before, I'm doing this. And he said, I didn't get you a research grant to do that. I said, no, I have to do this. He said, well, carry on cleaning out the pigeon crap and rat crap, and you can carry on doing that crazy stuff you've stumbled across. Just keep the lab clean, that's your job, and that's why we pay you. I said, deal, done. And I spent most of my life, academic life, doing deals that would allow me to carry on my work, including 9 years as a head of a department, which damn near killed me, but anyway, it's another story. So, the first thing that Steve needed to do then was not to dump the terms and concepts of equivalence relations per se. They were fine for equivalence, but you needed names that were more generic for what he referred to as frames, relational frames. And I don't think I've ever asked him directly, but I think he got the concept of a frame from reading Skinner, from autoclitic frame, but he redefined it as a type of way of understanding the operant. And so this is very close, of course, to what Murray had proposed here, where if you relate, if I tell you this is called a limu. That's not English, by the way, just in case. That's we call them lemons, just in case. It's a made-up word. And another one is betraying, and so we say another word for limu is betraying. Neither word is a proper English word, it's just made up. Then you can get what Murray would have described as symmetry. If you hear the word betraying, you can say, oh, that's another word for limu. And this thing is called a limu, if you're told that limu is this thing. And then you can even generate the classic equivalence relation and say, oh, this is a betraying, and this word over here stands for this object here. This is referred to in RFT, these red lines as mutual entailment, and these green lines here as combinatorial entailment. You can think of this as a generic name for symmetry, and this is a generic name for transitivity and equivalence, or combined symmetry and transitivity or an equivalence in this context, because this is a frame of equivalence or a frame of coordination. But there are many more frames like it. He also added in, Steve, in relational frame theory, what he called a third property, which Sidman had not, called the transformation of functions, because you have to bear in mind that Steve was a clinical psychologist and he wanted to understand how language had its psychological impact on listeners and speakers, to the detriment very often, because as a clinical psychologist he was working with why language was such a problem for us. And another side issue to the whole story is, of course, that language has been a great benefit, but it also brings a lot of suffering to the table as well, which again is not the subject of this talk, but this is the driving force. So we added in this third defining feature of relational frame theory, which is referred to as the transformation of functions. And basically this is what gives relational frame theory its utility, makes it something that's about application, about really trying to understand how language has its impact, and changes the way in which we interact with our natural world in a way that animals do not. And that is that when stimuli become related to each other, so in ways like this, it can transform or change the functions of previously neutral stimuli. So that, for example, actual lemons have a lot of functions. They make you salivate, they taste sour. If I ask you to close your eyes and think of a lemon, you might think of the colour yellow. You might categorize it as a type of citrus fruit. You might say, oh, I'll make lemonade out of it. If I pick it up and touch it, it's bumpy and hard to the feel, and so on. If you've been exposed to this type of training where you've heard limu is a lemon and limu is betraying, and I ask you to close your eyes now and think about biting into a betraying. Imagine what it's like to take a nice fresh betraying, sink your teeth into it and really suck hard on it now. Some of you might even start to feel just a bit of salivation going on there, like if you'd just bitten into a lemon. Now before you walked into this room and I said imagine eating a betraying, you'd go, what are you talking about? I don't know what that is. But forevermore now, you're changed. You know, years from now, I could come to you and say, imagine biting into a betraying and really biting down on that piece of fruit. What's it doing to you? Oh, it's very sour or whatever. And you'll be affected in a way just by that small piece of relational responding that you've learned here today as part of this talk. Now, that's sort of trivial in a way, but of course words have all sorts of meanings. People will fight and die over words and symbols. You know, it's illegal, I don't know if it's illegal in Brazil, but it was illegal in the US to burn the flag. What is the flag, the national flag? It's just a bit of cloth with some colour on it. But you could be arrested and put in prison for burning it in public as an act of protest. And certainly in many countries, if you go into the street and burn the national flag, you're probably going to be in trouble fairly quickly, either by the police or by citizens of that country. Don't take too kindly to burning flags. And if somebody calls you a name, you know, the usual thing, sticks and stones may not break, blah, blah, but people are insulted, they're annoyed, they're irritated, people kill each other literally over things that we say. So words are very powerful, and they have this power over us through what Steve defined as the transformations of functions. It changes the functions of words and symbols so that they actually come to mean or acquire some of the actual properties of the things for which they stand. When you burn the national flag of a country, you are, in one sense, in a psychological sense, burning that country. You're attempting to destroy that country in which people live, symbolically speaking. It's a real act of aggression. And so in that sense, you can understand why people are so protective of it. Otherwise, it's just a piece of cloth. And if I went into the street and burned a tea towel, I'd say, what's that madman doing? But they wouldn't necessarily attack me or see me as a threat to the national interest. Now, the other thing that was core to Steve's suggestion of RFT at this time was the introduction of two types of contextual control. One which he referred to as contextual control for the relationship, and he said there are cues that determine which frame applies. So in RFT, the frame that's most common for establishing things like equivalence relations are, you know, this means that, this is a lemon. So for example, the phrase is a, or that is the name for, pointing, looking at and naming, they're all cues, some of them paralinguistic, for forming an equivalence relation or a frame of coordination between this and that. Otherwise, if you don't have cues, if you don't have contextual cues that control the relations, everything would collapse into everything else, and everything would be equivalent to everything else, and there'd be no separate classes. But the other cue that he introduced, which is also essential, was what's called the context for the transformation of functions. Because again, if all functions transferred, and not just some, then again, people would literally try and, you know, eat the word lemon. And you sometimes see kids do this. They see a picture of an ice cream, or even the word ice cream, and they literally lick it off the page. And they find out fairly quickly that that doesn't work too well. So what C-funcs do, they provide context for some of the functions to actualize based on the relations involved. So you might say, for example, if you think of the family dog, and say, what's your dog's name? And if you say, oh, we have a dog, it's called whatever, Rover or something, and say, well, what does Rover smell like? And you might think, and say for a minute, some of the olfactory functions of your family dog might come to mind. If it's a smelly dog, well, then you'll say, oh, it's quite smelly. If it doesn't smell too bad, so, oh, a bit dog-like, but generally okay. What does he look like? Then you might, again, get a picture of your family dog. What does he sound like when he barks? And so on. So different functions are actualized or occur for you, psychological functions, that are independent of the relation. The relation remains the same. It's dog, family dog, Rover, refers to only one thing, stands for only one thing. But then when I ask about the questions, I add in C-funcs and say, what does it smell like? What does it look like? What does it feel like when you pet it? Different functions are evoked in that instance. So, and in any instance of relational framing, according to RFT, involves relating and also involves specific functions. And not all functions transfer in one instance. Otherwise, when you saw the word Rover written on a piece of paper, you'd literally try and put a lead round its neck and take it for a walk. The word, that is, rather than the dog. And that wouldn't be very useful a behaviour to evolve in the human species. But nonetheless, as I said, burning flags, you know, is an area in which there is perhaps an instance in which the transformation of functions is so powerful it can lead to physical violence. And of course, as Yvonne will elaborate later, there are situations in which we turn language on ourselves. Language can become almost like a cancer when it gets turned on us, when we turn it on who we are, or what we are, or how we feel that we might be. So the simple phrase, I am useless, I'll never be good enough, one day I will die and everything won't matter anymore. We're taking language is starting to behave like a cancer. It's eating away at our own psychology. And part of the role of what was driving Steve to develop RFT was a way to understand that the pernicious negative aspects of language as well as their positive aspects. RFT can be used to build, hopefully, better language training programs for children who have language deficits. But it's also a way of trying to better understand how language turns inward and becomes almost humorous and starts to attack the very fabric of our own psychology and our own fit with our verbal worlds, our human companions. And we see that in the case of what we describe as mental illness. Human psychological suffering is a better phrase for it, because we're all subject to it. There isn't anyone in this room who won't struggle psychologically at some point, not because you are ill, but because you have evolved the ability to language. Once you can language, you can build futures that are full of hope, that are full of thoughts of pleasure, success, achievement, and in the same way you can build a future that is despairing and has nothing but meaninglessness and emptiness in front of you for years to come. And indeed a lot of ancient wisdom and religion emerged in human culture to deal with this double-edged sword that we call human language. If you think, I was raised a Roman Catholic, my parents, although I'm English, my parents were Irish and they were strong Roman Catholics. So when I think about a lot of the things that I was exposed to when I was raised a Catholic is, number one, guilt. Lots and lots of guilt in there. But also, when I think back to some of the prayers and the practices and so on, they were about learning how to deal with the pernicious aspects of language itself. So that, from my point of view, a lot of it is metaphors to deal with how to handle human psychological suffering. So take, for example, very briefly, because I will come back to this, if you take something like the Passion of Christ. I'm not, by the way, religious in any way, but I'm just giving you this as a way in which religion has tried to do this. It gives a metaphor. It does two things. It tells you that what happens during the Passion of Christ. Two disciples are in there, right? One is Judas Iscariot, and the other is it's Peter, isn't it? And both of those guys do something terrible to Christ during the crucifixion. They both deny him. They both betray him. Judas does it for 30 pieces of silver, and it is Peter, isn't it, who denies him 3 times or something, and Jesus predicts that. So before the night is over, you will, deny me 3 times. No, I won't. And of course, the cock crows, and Peter denies him, and he is distraught. But they have 2 different approaches to how to handle this. Judas goes away, and as a result of betraying Christ for 30 pieces of silver, he commits the sin that cannot be forgiven. What is that sin? The sin is despair. Because he hangs himself from a tree, he commits suicide. And language can do that. Steve wrote a wonderful paper in the 90s on how language leads to suicide, and we don't see this in any other species. It's a wonderful piece of writing. But what is the metaphor here? One person despairs, Judas despairs. He doesn't go to Christ when he's on the cross and say, "Forgive me, I'm the one who betrayed you," because Christ would have forgiven him. Okay. What Peter does, though, he doesn't despair. This is the rock on which literally the Catholic Church is built. He is the first pope, if you like. So you have two different ways of dealing with your own acts of self-destruction, of not behaving well, of sinning, if you like. One despairs, kills himself, and that's it, game over. He can't contribute any more to the culture, he can't do any, it's over. Peter, on the other hand, helps build the Catholic Church to pass on the message that Christ had brought in his lifetime. That wisdom there is, how do we deal with human psychological suffering? You deal with it by presenting people with those types of metaphors. With saying, don't do this. When in your most despairing hour, language will eat at you. It will attack you like a cancer. How do I deal with that? And one way is for the culture to pass on these metaphors. Remember Judas. This too shall pass. Think of Peter. Don't think of Judas. Think of Peter. When you're in the depths of misery, you've lost someone close to you, you've failed in some way, don't reach for the gun, reach for life. And in a way that was religion. And just one example, all religions have these messages, ways of dealing with what language can do to us. And one of the most important things is to learn to forgive not only others but ourselves when we don't come up to some sort of a level of expectation, when we and sin against the group, when we behave in a way which is not supportive of the group, the people we cooperate with, when we let the ones down we love. How do I deal with that? Forgiveness. Hence forgiveness is a very important part of all religions, and religions have this way of saying, come back to the group, the prodigal son in Catholicism and so on. They're all about forgiving others and forgiving ourselves, because otherwise language will have its evil way with us. So, in a way, modern psychology and relational frame theory is an attempt to provide a way of understanding how we can handle language in the secular age. I mean, some people can have religion and that will suffice, but as we become increasingly secular in thinking, more and more people will need help to deal with the problems of language, human language, without reaching for a religious text. Okay? And that's, in a sense, what clinical psychology and human psychology in RFT terms is about. How do we learn to live with this incredibly powerful tool that has evolved for us, that has given us human civilization, but at the same time has allowed us to commit incredible acts, even to this day, incredible acts of terror and barbarism and war, and millions of people die, again, over what are verbal issues. Animals kill, when do they kill? Defend themselves and to eat, not much else, or defend their young. They don't kill each other in millions, as we have the capacity to do, based on categorizing people into groups that are in some way a threat to us. Okay. Well, those are the core concepts of RFT. Mutual entailment, combinatorial attainment, and transformation of function. And this is what RFT says is the unit of analysis, the basic unit of analysis for human language and cognition. And it's broader than Sidman's, but it is not much more advanced than that. And it directly tries to provide this monistic, naturalistic account. But what we have are definitions. The terms there are just definitions. They're not, if you like, an explanation, a behavioural explanation. What Steve says is that we're not born with this capacity to frame events relationally. We may have a predisposition to be able to learn to do it, and that's what we spend our early language learning is about, laying down the basics, and it becomes more and more complex. But RFT is very much about trying to specify what are the experiences we have to have, what are the learning experiences we have to have to learn to show these types of effects. And so, again, it's an operant account. It's Skinnerian that way. He says they're operants. They occur through exemplar training, so that, for example, as illustrated here. It's a fairly simple idea that when the young child, and there's now evidence to show this in research, experimental and even observational research, well, it's gone to sleep, that, like the lemon example, young children, when they're very young, they hear words all the time, and then they get things thrust into their face. So they hear the word lemon, or they hear the word teddy, or mummy, or daddy, or whatever, and then they get the thing put in their face. Oh, do you want teddy? Like it might be a toy or whatever, and then the thing is placed into their vision, and then they're engaging in a cooperative act with their parent. They're hearing the word, seeing an object. They're seeing the object and hearing the word. Back and forth, back and forth. Do you want this? Here, oh, there, you have it. That's a lemon. No, that's Teddy. Oh, look, here's Teddy. If you don't even have to have children. You know, you can be one of those who, oh, kids, I don't know. But if somebody puts you in front of a young baby, one of the first things you do is usually you might pick something up and say, oh, look. It can be a rattle, it can be just a toy that's in the kid's room. Oh, do you know who this is? You just can't help it. It's almost automatic for adults when you get a pre-verbal child to start talking to it. It's the bizarrest thing to do because the kid hasn't a clue what you're saying. Psychologically, at this stage, it's a chimp. It's an animal, it doesn't understand a word. It's just hearing blah, 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 blah. But, of course, it's evolving, so bit by bit, the contingencies start to select out. Those start to say more, and it's biologically programmed, evolution programmed, to start to mimic some of those sounds, and then it starts to mimic sounds, hears itself talking, or not talking, but making it sound like ba, 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 ma, 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 and so on. These core parts of the language. And even very early on, special parts of the native language start to predominate. And then bit by bit, it starts to hear itself saying things. And then, things that are important to it, it hears that characteristic sound. Things like food, milk, and so on. Teddy, daddy, mummy. These things that are important in the child's life for survival start to take form and start to be discriminated, start to get abstracted out. Just as physical sounds initially, but bit by bit, the verbal community shapes them up, and then you start to get this bidirectionality that's involved in naming. You hear words, you see the object, you see the object. You even can hear the word privately, just even smiling. If I put a lemon and say, this is a lemon to a child, they smile back at me and say, that's right, it's a lemon. Might not really understand what I've said, but just smiling at me is enough for me. That's right. And the social reinforcement and so on that comes with that across hundreds, thousands of exemplars on a daily and weekly basis, establishes after a while a unit, a new unit that didn't exist beforehand. And that is the frame of coordination, the frame of equivalence, the frame that Sidman first discovered. So that eventually what happens is you can now demonstrate symmetry. See, this object here is a tree, and then I can say to a child, point to a tree, and the child for the first time, without having to be taught directly that there's a tree, will point to that object. We see for the first time symbolic control at a young age. Occurs around 18 months of age, or around then, looks like thereabouts. That's when you start to see this emergence, this derivation, that you don't have before that age. And this is one of the reasons why humans require so much care for so long. They have to build these abilities. The more complex the mammal generally, the longer the period of dependency on parents. And the longer it needs to be protected by parents, the longer you need a social group who will bind together. The more you need to rely on aunts and uncles and conspecifics to protect the young as a group. This is evolution, modern evolution. It gets selected not at the genetic level, or just at the genetic level or the individual level, but at the level of the group, because groups survive when we provide the context for this type of learning, because this type of learning provides language, which provides for increased cooperation for the group, which helps the group to survive. And if the group survives, by definition, it grows in strength. It survives to tell the tale. other groups that don't evolve language in this way, don't protect each other in this way, don't cooperate in this way, don't survive as well. If you're not altruistic within your own group, so much the worse for your group. If you have a child and its parents die and no one takes that child in and protects it and nurtures it, overall, across time, that group suffers. So that's why you can't think of evolution as a purely genetic thing. That's why Darwin's up there. That's why I pointed out, I'm not a genetic evolutionary fan at all. I think of evolution as occurring at all levels. So this is the modern way. The old idea of evolution is gone. Things get selected at cellular level, at the genetic level, at the group level, and even at the symbolic level. And that's what RFT is about. It's about providing an evolutionary science of selection at the symbolic level, because things get selected symbolically, and that's what RFT is about. That's why it goes back to Darwin. Okay, so there we select, we reinforce, we establish the operant of framing itself through the very normal way operants are trained or learned, through providing consequences for their emission. But as I said, just to emphasize again, don't need to go into this in detail, but what happens, of course, is there are many types of frames. Frames are not just about equivalence or coordination. Things can be bigger and smaller, more or less, taller and shorter, prettier than, uglier than, to the left of, to the right of, in front of, behind. You can go on and on. They can be opposite. Cold is the opposite of hot. They can be hierarchical. A dog is a category for my dog Rover, but my dog Rover's a Labrador, so it's a large dog. There are smaller dogs. They're over there. Put them in one category, put the other here. You've got two groups, two frames of coordination related in a frame of hierarchy with the superordinate label dog, and so on and so on. And you can develop an idea of these types of things, or of relation networks, which I'll come to in a minute. And these things can have functions, and their functions change as a result of the relations in which they participate. So, a small bag of money is worth less than a larger bag of money. And by the way, there's no money in these or anything. This is two bags, and if I said, which of these would you like? Then you'd say that one, just because it's larger, or participates in a frame of large, but it's going to be larger. But we learn frames initially, or so it seems, based on their physical properties, things being physically bigger or smaller than each other, physically feeling different, cold feels different to hot, things they look different, close versus up, far away, things that's taller than that thing, or someone can run faster than this other person, or slow, and rabbits or hares are fast, tortoises are slow, and so on. And the physical properties of those things are key. And then what happens during, not in a strictly stage-like way, the learning to respond to these things relationally gets applied arbitrarily, and this is what RFT, this is the final thing, but it's the final piece of RFT, if you like, is you learn to respond to arbitrary stimuli as if they were physically different in some way. So it's the as if, which is key here. That's, you can think of RFT as the as-if theory of human language and cognition. You take arbitrary things and then they respond to them as if they were related physically, as specified by the language community using those terms and concepts. So, in Europe, in Europe,
Ó, Cláudio, desce o cabo e conecta no microfone.
Thank you. So we learn to respond to these things as if they were physically different from each other, rather than what they look like. So in Europe, for example, we have the euro. A 50-cent coin is larger than €1 coin, but is smaller in value. The €2 coin is bigger than €1 coin. That is more in value. But we learn, when you come to Europe, you have to learn, oh, this coin's bigger than that, but it's worth less. And that's not infrequent in coins, but it's one example in which the physical properties of stimuli are not the basis for responding to them. We have to learn by convention from our verbal community how these things relate to each other. And you can have numbers on planes and other things as well. I won't go into that. You should get the general idea. So relational frame theory is an operant account. What happens is you get explicitly trained to summarize a frame such as if A is more than B and B is more than C. You then learn that C is less than A, and young children have to learn that. They have to be taught that. It's a frame, hence in the box here, with things like C reals for more, C real for less, and things like then worth or value get transformed. So if A is money, then you want A rather than C. Or if C is, if it's not money, but it's something that's unpleasant, like a poison or something, and you have to drink one of them, you've no choice, you're going to pick perhaps C rather than A because it's the least poisonous one or the least toxic one. And that gets trained across exemplars, so you have A, B, C, then you get another exemplar, D, E, F, and so on. And you get many of these types of exemplars until eventually you learn to respond to the stimuli without direct training. So if I tell you now, G is more than H and H is more than I, these are novel stimuli you haven't come across, you don't even need to know what it is. Everyone in this room now will be able to tell me immediately, because you're educated folks, you've grown up in the verbal community, I is less than G. You can derive that for free. You don't need to be told it directly. And it's this core unit of analysis, this is the operant unit of analysis that lies at the core of human language and cognition. And from this you can build up, you can scale up complexity in a way that suddenly starts to look very much like human language and cognition, the generative power and complexity that we associate with human language. So, and I'll race through this. So if you learn a small number of relations now, you can get incredible, just to give you a flavour of how complex things can become and the power of it. Imagine you're told, I presume you have The Simpsons. What you do, I saw it on Brazilian TV the other night, which was rather bizarre to hear for me anyway, to hear Bart Simpson speaking in Portuguese. Doesn't sound like that at all in the American version. Anyway, so if I tell you Homer is older than Lisa, and Lisa's older than Maggie, and Homer's younger than Abe Simpson, his father, and Abe is younger than Monty Burns, then you've only 4 relations there, 4 simple relations. But out of that, and you can get kids to do this, give them enough time, bit of paper to write it out, you can get, from 4 trained relations, these are a summary of what I've just shown you, out of that comes what we describe as a very complex relational network, so that you can work out that Monty's older than Maggie, and Montgomery Burns, Monty's older than Homer, Homer's older than Maggie, and so on. None of these blue lines are trained. They're derived from the trained, or could be derived from the trained. And so, with human language and cognition, the concept of human language and cognition as inherently relational gives us this. And this can be the underpinning of stories and narratives, and the way in which we pass on information from one generation to the next. What if you think of what stories are, what are they? What are fairy tales? what is the Bible? It's a passion of Christ. I just talked about it. This is why I talked about it. It's a way of passing on information from one generation to the next about how to live, how to protect yourself from toxic berries, from meat that isn't cooked properly, but also from your own language. Because that's the paradox. The thing that gives you the power to cooperate, the thing that gives you the ability to love as we do, to hope for the future, to dream of things undreamt of, to dream of going to heaven. For me to dream of Chelsea winning the Champions League again,